Hi, my name is Heatherlyn Wilkes, and I'm a home-to-home group life leader at Richwoods East Campus. And I'm here today to share with you some thoughts on the last sermon in our Generous Life series, Open Your Hands. One theme that has run all the way through this series is that people really want to be generous. But there are a lot of things that seem to get in the way of that. The first sermon talked about how we need to open our eyes just to see the needs and opportunities around us to be generous. Next, we talked about opening our hearts and taking a look at some of the sin that might be in there that keeps us from being generous. Then we talked about opening our minds, this idea of looking at some false beliefs and assumptions that we might have that keep us from leading a truly generous life. And our last sermon talked about the idea of prying open the last thing that hinders us sometimes from being generous, and that's our hands. Let me share a story with you. When my husband Jeff and I had been married about a year, he had a conversation at work with a guy named Doug. And Jeff came home from this conversation and in turn wanted to have a conversation with me about our giving. After having this conversation at work, he was really afraid that our hearts were not in the right place when it came to our giving, particularly our giving to our local church. Now, at this point in time, we had just bought a house. We didn't have kids yet, so we were happily spending our dual income, not being overly responsible. We did give regularly at church, but I will tell you, by the time the end of the month rolled around and the money was short, we liked to pretend that wasn't affecting us financially, when in reality, it was very, very hard to let go of that money. Well, then Jeff has to go and have this conversation with Doug. And in the course of this conversation, everybody's favorite topic about tithing came up. And that's the question: do you tithe on your gross income, or do you tithe on your net income? In a completely non-judgmental way, Doug said to Jeff, I always ask myself this question: do I want God to bless me netly, or do I want God to bless me grossly? It's a very interesting question. In other words, do I want God to treat me the way that I treat him? Doug was definitely not advocating some sort of magic formula to get God to shower gross amounts of blessings on us. But he did have a very valid point he was making about what we do with the blessings that God has given us. Giving is one of the very few areas in the Bible where God challenges us to test him. But do we hold on so tightly to our money, to our time, to our resources, and to our energy that we actually miss opportunities for God to shower us with his best desires for our lives? Do we actually grieve God when we assume that what we have now is all that we'll ever have, when perhaps all he really wants us to do is open our hands a little bit and see what he might be able to do in our lives? So I'll tell you, when Jeff came home with this great idea about tithing on 10% of our gross income, I was not 100% on board. But I was convicted enough by his conviction to go along with it for a little while. At this point in time, we had a school loan that suddenly came due. We also had a mortgage payment that was not based on a budget that included tithing on 10% of our gross income. But we decided to do it anyway. The first thing we learned was that we needed to write that check on that gross amount, that 10% of our gross income, right off the top and give it to our church immediately. As we continued with the discipline of that type of giving, what we found is very slowly but surely our ownership of that money, this idea that that money belonged to us, as if it ever did, that slowly started to ebb away. The money truly became God's. And as we were able to open our hands and let go of our ownership with that money, we found a freedom in not worrying about giving that money away. And we began to flourish in not having that money to start with. Now, this sermon is obviously not completely about money, although that is the easiest application of it. Perhaps we're stingy with our time or with our energy. What I've generally found is that we find the time, we find the money, we find the energy and the resources to do what we love. Maybe it's time to think about asking God to give us a love for living a generous life? I think it's at least something to think about. As you move into your time of discussion with your group, thinking about this idea of opening our hands and seeing what God can do, how He can bless us, I'd like you to share with each other an unexpected or unusual blessing that you have received. How did that blessing change you or your situation? I hope that you have a great conversation. Thanks for listening.